Hi, my name is Robert. I'm going to teach you how to cook a perfect New York strip steak. First step, of course, get your steak out of the refrigerator. Grab a plate, unwrap your steak. Get it ready. Next thing you're going to do, grab a couple paper towels. Make sure you dry your steak off. When you unwrap it, it's going to be covered in a bunch of juice. You don't want that. All it does is make your steak soggy, and when you actually go to sear it in a pan, it's going to boil the steak more than sear the steak. You're actually going to create a lot of steam because the water and the oil don't like each other very much. So go ahead and just get this guy as dry as you can. And toss your paper towels. Next up, you're going to want to season the steak. I've got some kosher salt. Put a good bit of seasoning on. Some fresh cracked pepper. Flip the steak with one hand so that you can use the other one to continue seasoning. And then if you have enough seasoning on the plate, just go ahead and take the side that hasn't been seasoned and kind of tap it into it so that you get a little bit of a coating there. And then if you're really into it, a little salt right down along the fat. And that'll help flavor some of the oil that comes out of the steak while you're cooking it. Now your steak is seasoned. You're going to let it sit for at least an hour so that it can come up to room temperature before you throw it onto the pan. Otherwise it won't cook evenly and the inside will be raw even though you've cooked the outside. And if you do end up cooking the inside to good medium rare or medium, the outside will be burned by the time you get to that point. So make sure you let your steak come up to room temperature. Now why are we seasoning the steak and then letting it come up to room temperature? Why don't we let it come to room temperature and then season it before we put it into the pan? Well, the reason behind that is, when you season the steak and then let it sit, the salt will actually dry out some of the moisture from the steak. And then what will happen is the steak will actually suck some of that moisture back into it while it's resting. If you keep an eye on your steak while it's coming up to room temperature, you'll notice that after a couple of minutes it'll start getting very wet on the surface again, even though you just patted it down. That's the moisture coming out. That's some of the enzymes and some of the water coming out of the steak. If you let the steak sit, either through evaporation or through it sucking some of that moisture back into itself, it'll actually absorb some of the seasoning that you just put on it. If you season a steak and then throw it right into a pan, that's going to steam right off. You're not going to get as much flavor into the steak as you would if you season it and let it sit. It's almost like a marinade. It's basically salt marinating the steak, and it makes the steak a lot tastier. Alright, so it's been about an hour. Let's go ahead and cook our steak. Alright, the first thing you're going to want to do is turn your pan to about medium heat and start getting that guy warm. You never want to cook steak or any kind of meat in a cold pan because you won't get that sear on it, you won't get that flavor. You want to let the pan preheat for probably about 3 or 4 minutes and let it get nice and warm. Alright, now that your pan's hot, you're going to add your oil. You're going to turn your temperature down just a little bit to about medium-low, just right under medium. I'm using olive oil, but you can also use a higher temperature oil, usually like a peanut oil or something like that. And then you can have your temperature up higher than if you're using olive oil. Go ahead and add your oil. Coat your pan. Go ahead and lay your steak in, making sure to lay it away from you. Now you're going to leave it here for 3 to 5 minutes on this side, and I like to cook my steaks about medium. If you wanted a medium rare, you'd probably do 2 to 4 minutes aside. If you wanted well done, you're probably going to want to use the oven, but we'll get into that later. Now what you're going to start to see actually on this side of the steak, I don't know if you can see it very well in the video, but yeah, you can. This area right here, you can see the gray color start to kind of move up the steak. That's the steak cooking. And what you're going to want to do is try and leave the steak sitting down until it's cooked about halfway through on this side. Maybe just a little bit less. I'm actually going to flip mine right now because I can see that there's a crust forming. And that usually means that the one side is nice and brown, which is what you want on a steak. You definitely want that color. If you don't have a good color on your steak, you're not going to get very much flavor out of it. It's going to taste kind of mushy. It's not going to have that nice cooked flavor. Now I always add a little bit of butter. And I baste my steak, and the reason isn't so much to keep the steak moist, because this really doesn't do anything for that, but what it does is it helps to keep heat on both sides of the steak, so the steak cooks evenly, and it cooks all the way through. So we're going to leave this guy in here for just about another 2 or 3 minutes. And as you can see, this whole side of the steak right now is actually pretty much all gray. So the steak is getting cooked all the way through, which is what you want. Nothing sucks more than to have a nicely done outside and a completely raw or undercooked steak in the center. Now there are a lot of schools of thought when it comes to how often should you flip your steak. I am of the mind that it doesn't really matter how many times you flip your steak. Actually, there's a website called SeriousEats.com, and they pretty much prove that the more often you flip your steak, the more evenly it'll cook, and the quicker it'll cook. But I can't bring myself to turn my steak as often as they recommend. I generally let the basting do the flipping for me. It accomplishes similar goals. You can either flip often or you can baste. I like basting. And you see we've got a nice color on both sides. But this fat on the back here still kind of looks kind of gross. So what I'm going to do is actually turn my steak onto its back. And just kind of hold in here for a minute, just to let the fat kind of render out and sear. You see, we got a really nice color on that fat on the back, which is what you want. Now I actually added a little bit too much butter to my steak, which is easy to do, but I didn't add way too much, so the steak is still actually searing. It's not boiling. If you add a lot of butter or a lot of oil, you're actually going to boil your steak rather than sear it, and that'll also make your steak taste kind of mushy. It won't cook all the way. It won't cook evenly. Alright, so this guy is just about done. I'm going to go ahead and put them on a separate plate. I'm going to pour the butter and the oil and the steak fat over the steak. Now what I'm going to do is let the steak rest for 5 to 10 minutes. And a lot of people say, why would you let the steak rest that long? It's going to start getting cold. And the reason that you let the steak rest is because it lets the juices of the steak redistribute. It also finishes cooking. Now what I like to do is very loosely kind of cover the foil. Turn off your burner. And then just poke a hole or 2 or 3 in the foil, and that lets some of the moisture escape, and that keeps your steak from kind of going soggy. Alright, so now for sort of the moment of truth, and you'll have to excuse me, I have been cooking what we're actually going to eat for dinner while I've been doing this video, so let me clean some of that up. We're actually going to be having homemade 3-cheese tortellini and chicken marsala. So if you feel your tin foil, you'll feel that it is still warm. It's kind of holding the heat in from the steak. Just go ahead and carefully take that off because you have all of those juices in there. as I trip over my camera stand. Alright, so there we go. Here's our steak. Get this out of the way. And let's go ahead and get this cut open. There you go. Wonderfully cooked to a perfect medium. It's pretty much even all the way throughout. It's got a lovely crust on the outside. Didn't have to go in the oven. You just cook it for, I guess it was pretty much 2.5 to 3 minutes aside for this one. And just make sure you baste it, because the basting is what actually, in my opinion, keeps the steak cooking evenly. It doesn't add to the moisture, it doesn't add to any of the juices. It does add flavor. It adds a lovely buttery flavor, but it doesn't do anything to, make it more juicy or anything like that. But it does help it cook evenly. It does help it cook all the way through, and it will. You don't have to throw the steak in the oven, so it makes that a little bit easier for you. And hopefully you guys can replicate it at home. Now, for most of the cooking, I had the steak, or I had the range set at about, I don't know, I would say 4.5 out of 10. So not straight down, not a straight medium, but just in between medium low and medium. So right around there, and you should have perfect steak. You should be able to get your oil in your pan just barely smoking before you start cooking, and then you should have perfect steak. And obviously, if you have a thicker steak, you're going to want to cook it longer on each side. You might want to flip it more often just to get it so that it doesn't burn, so you don't get that. You will still develop a crust on each side. It'll just take a little bit longer. Or you might want to consider throwing it into an oven. These steaks here are about 1 inch thick, so just for comparison. All right, have a good one. Good luck.